各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看本期的《文明之旅》，我是杨瑞。今天我为大家介绍一位中国人民的老朋友 ，Robert Lawrence Cohen。好，接下来让我们用热烈的掌声，请出我们今天的嘉宾。Dr. Cohen, may I serve tea for you?
谢谢你。
大家说他的中文讲得怎么样？再讲几句好不好 ？A few more Chinese sentences, please.
我非常高兴见面所有的人，各位来宾，我非常高兴今天见面所有的，因为我的中文还不好，没有时间学习中文，我必须说英文。下次我很喜欢说中文。
Let me show you the two books that Dr. Cohen wrote. One is called The Inside Story of China's 30-Year Reform, How China's Leaders Think and What This Means for the Future. Now, this is the Chinese version and this is the English version. I mean, how many years did they took you to write?
Yeah, this book took about 2 years, and once again, it is very, very intense work. But when people read my books or hear me, they often say in the West that I am discounting China's problems and only talking about the achievements. And you know something? That's not true. But here's what is true. In my books, I talk about all of China's problems, imbalances, corruption, pollution, political disputations. All of the things are in my books. The difference is, when other people in the Western media talk about China's problems, that's all they talk about. So 95% of what they deal with, which is news, are the negative things. And I've said, even if all the negative things that the Western media says about China is true, it's still only a percentage of the story. What percentage? We can argue. But what I try to do is tell the whole picture. So if somebody reads my books who is a China critic, they're annoyed that I deal with some positive things as well as the problems. The problems are there, but it has to be embedded within a story that's the richness and the complexity of China. And that's what I try to do. Some people say, do you try to be balanced about China? And I say, no, I am not balanced. I try to tell the truth. Now, maybe I don't know the truth, maybe I'm not smart enough, maybe I don't have access, but I try to tell the truth. There's a difference between being truthful and being balanced, because truth can be on one side or the other, or it can be in the middle. And it's harder to be truthful than to be balanced. If I were writing about China 40 years ago, I would try to tell the truth and it wouldn't be balanced, it would be mostly negative. And that's what I do today. I try to tell the truth.
2005年，库恩的著作《他改变了中国》江泽民传一经出版，便成为当年的畅销书。4年后，库恩推出了他的另一本著作《中国30年人类社会的一次伟大变迁》。为了完成这本书，库恩走访了20多个省份的40多个城市，采访了上百位亲历改革开放的省部级官员和普通百姓。在这本书中，库恩通过自己创造性的工作，观察中国社会不同层面发生的变化，并将这些变化作为素材，与各个领域的专家学者和不同地区的管理者、领导人进行探讨。他敏锐地发掘了改革开放30年给中国的深刻影响。在见证中国改革开放巨大变迁的同时，他坚持将中国放在国际政治、经济和社会大环境中去审慎地比较，力图讲述一个多元真实的中国故事。What specific events have deeply influenced your outlook about the image of China? By writing 2 books, you want to deliver an objective and complete picture about what is going on and what has taken place in China.
Yeah,
Tell us a few examples.
I wrote the books in order to learn. I realized when I thought I knew a lot about China. When I did this documentary in the year 2000 and that we talked about earlier. And I enjoyed that. It was about what's happening in China today, from migrant workers, rural women, entrepreneurs, new business. And I realized after a while, when I saw President Zhang on an interview in the United States, and he talked about his life and the history
Legacy.
of China, and his what he went through during the Japanese occupation and the Civil War and the struggles, I realized I didn't know very much about China. And so the motivation for my doing the first book on President Zhang was to learn myself about this rich and tumultuous time. And I did. I lived through interviews and in front of my computer screen and thinking about this and research. And then I wanted to help Westerners live through this same period. Again, not as using President Zhang as his life exemplified this rich and tumultuous period of time. And that was a life-changing experience to me. Because it was this, when you're so involved in writing, it's as if I literally lived through that period of time. I mean, I could almost dream that I lived through that. You can almost have a false memory.
Perhaps, Dr. Kuan, arrogance or assertiveness are not the correct words to describe the national pride of this country. In your very first chapter, you talked about dignity, and you mentioned Professor Bi Dachuan. Tell us more about the story.
This is
in the context of perhaps the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
Yes. This is a story that goes back to the early 1990s. It was one of my first trips, maybe 1992, very, very early. Right after 1989, I had come back. I'd not been for a while, but one of my first trips back. And this one individual, we were in meetings, and he seemed very critical of the Chinese government. And at that point, today it's maybe less obvious. People can do it much more today, but then it was a very sensitive time. And I was really shocked to see in a meeting of 20 associates that there was this criticism of the government in very sarcastic and humorous ways. And so I didn't know too much, and when I was alone with this professor on a mountain someplace, I kind of said, because the U.S. at that time had blackballed China's for getting the 2000 Olympics. This goes back to the 2000 Olympics, when China tried to get the Olympics in 2000, but they were blackballed because of the residual feelings about 1989. And so I thought that was good. And so I told this professor that was, good that America did that because of what had happened. And he just criticized me horrendously. He said, "You stupid American, you don't know what you're talking about. How could you do this to China? This is a dumb thing." And I was shocked, because here he had criticized the government so strongly. And at that time I realized what you said, the difference between a simple criticism of government, whichever government may be in power or leaders, and a deep feeling of pride and nationalism about China's history, China's culture, and that transcended all of the little problems that may be of the moment. And that was just a significant fact, and it really was like a neon sign that lit up. And so now I begin to understand a little more about China. I understand about the people's pride and their history and their culture and their civilization that goes far beyond some of the local things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
In short, simply because you are critical of the social realities, it doesn't mean that you do not love your country.
In fact, loyalty is telling the truth. Loyalty is not always saying yes to those in authority, but it's telling them what is helpful to make them do their job or think better, but to do it in a way that you want it to succeed. Many Western critics criticize China, and they want China to fail. I have a long-standing debate with one, actually a Chinese American, who is extremely critical of China and has written books about when China is going to collapse. He keeps being wrong. I don't know why he's still considered a critic, because every time he's saying China is going to collapse, it doesn't. But he still, people like to hear that, so they talk. He still has a platform. But he's rooting for China to collapse to justify his theories. I'm rooting for China to succeed, but sometimes he and I see the same problems. We see the same problems. I agree with his analysis, but he's showing that that's going to be because China will fail, and I'm saying China is succeeding, but needs to change this point, needs to improve on that, because that would make China better, and if China is better, the whole world.
In one of the chapters, you mentioned one senior government official, whose name you didn't mention, complained to you that whatever we do, we'll make a mistake. We will be blamed because they say there's a lack of transparency when it comes to the ambitious space programs. But when the authorities decided to do live broadcast of the project, they say, your neighbors got scared.
Yeah, right.
What does that mean?
This is a great story because the Chinese are sensitive, like anyone else, particularly in China, that if you broadcast a space shot and there's a disaster, it will make everybody miserable and it's very bad. And so the world says that China is too secretive. And so the leadership at the highest level finally decided for one launch that, okay, this time we're going to take a chance, because it might be a disaster, but broadcast it live. We're going to really open up China. This is something we need to progress on this. And then they were totally dismayed to see now that China has allowed its space program to be filmed. Some people said that China was trying to intimidate its neighbors by showing its power. So if we don't do it, we're accused of being secretive and not transparent. If we do it, we're accused of intimidating. I mean, you know, that's the real world. But the decision they made is right. Transparency is a wonderful word. That it's not going to be, there's no perfection. There's no magic bullet. So whenever you can move towards transparency, it's a sign of China increasing its self-confidence and not worrying about what people say or not say, but just being confident in itself. And that will have a very good effect, ultimately, on public opinion. But when you do one thing and it turns out badly, like this example, you don't let it worry you. You know that they made the right decision. Transparency is good. Ultimately will be good for China. Keep going in that direction.
Despite the complaints from the West about the so-called transparency issue for China, the Chinese have a lot to complain about. What's wrong with the international financial order? This is the game rules set up by industrial nations. You guys are latecomers. You have to wait a minute because we want to enjoy the privileges of the established international financial order. What do you think of the Chinese concerns?
I do agree that there has to be a transformation in the world, and you're getting, the economies of the emerging markets are now going to be more than 50% of the world market. So there has to be a change. There's no question about it. But people are not. There may be some people who are trying to maintain the old order, but it is very complicated because you start with this massive difference between the societies. If you go back 30 years, massive difference, and you're changing this within a short period of time. And the reason China is able to emerge is because of the international market. Those companies that went bankrupt wouldn't have been companies if they weren't selling to the outside world. So it's a mutually complicated factor. But the fact is that China and India and other countries must have a greater participation in the way the world is working. That's the only way that things will be satisfied. And it's more than that. It's that over time there has to be in the world a more even distribution of wealth. But that should not come by fiat or by artificial means. It should be by hard work of everyone, because that's the only way. It's nobody's fault that there were all these differences. It's a historical. We can go back and talk about a million things of history. China has border disputes with a lot of different countries. They're all matters of history. It's complicated. Similarly, we have these disparities in income. As we look to the future, we have to have ways of achieving that. China is achieving that in the best possible way, and that's by the hard work of its people. Now, the workers in China have borne the brunt of the success, and many people in the urban areas of China have benefited when other workers in other areas have done that work, and you're benefiting by that. Everybody benefits in different ways. We have to work together as humanity to figure out how to smooth the process towards this greater equality and greater wealth. It's hard, and only by good thinking, by good dialogue, to plug your show, this will achieve.
Let's take a look at the footage.
库恩常常提起前国家科委主任、前国务委员宋健博士，说宋健是他最感激的人，因为当年正是宋健的邀请，库恩才得以来到中国，并与中国结下了深深的缘分。
我们是80年代，我们那个时候搞科学技术体制改革的时候，他还有几位美国朋友一块儿来，给我们出主意，就是怎么样能让科学研究，更好的跟市场相结合。那后来我就发现他对基础研究也很熟，过了不到5年，他对中国的情况就像是一个专家了，非常坦诚的把中国的情况比较真实的报道到美国和世界各地。
Do you think you deserve the title of being a China hand?
You know, I think the answer is no. I never did that. That was not my motivation. But I just love China. I first came to China at Dr. Song Jian's invitation. He was head of all science and technology from 1985 to 1988. In 1989, we had a conference, and I came as an investment banker who was a scientist to help the science industries develop, as you say. Dr. Song Jian is really, to me, one of the great examples of leaders, not just in China, but in the entire world. He's a real scientist who became a leader, and then who left his science in order to help the country and to develop the science in terms of technology. And then when he retired, and he was in the CPPC as a vice chairman, but after that, he really devoted himself back to his science because he loved science, a real, true individual. He's very sensitive politically, very sensitive, a human being, and very cultured, and loves to communicate and loves to see the emergence of China in the world through knowledge.
Dr. Kuhn, you have met with many senior government officials, high-ranking government officials, and they encouraged you to give an objective account of what you see here in my country.
Right.
What did they say to you in most cases?
Well, I like to begin this way, because when people in the West see that I wrote the biography of President Zhang and have had access in my current book to many of the senior leaders, many of the current leaders today when they were leaders of provinces like Vice President Xi Jinping and
you met him in 2006 when he was the top administrator of Zhejiang province.
Zhejiang province, and Li Keqiang, Li Yuanchao. They assume that everything I'm a quasi-spokesman for the government, and that's not true at all. Everything that I have published in the West in over almost 20 years, every time I'm on television, everything I've written, not once has any Chinese official looked at what I would write prior to publication, and not once have they ever even asked to see what I would write prior to publication in the West.
In other words, there is no censorship for what you wrote?
For what I write outside of China, not only no censorship, but no one even asked. There was one time 10 years ago when, by contract, one middle-level Chinese official had the right to edit something I had, and a senior Chinese official told that person he shouldn't do it because he wasn't qualified. But anything I publish in China, China has a right to publish what it feels, and we have very strict ground rules on that. But anything I publish outside of China, no one sees it. Not only doesn't censor it, they don't see it prior to publication. After, of course, they see it. Now, this is something the Western media find shocking.
In a word, how could you win the trust from the Chinese leaders?
It's by a track record. A track record. When I first did my first television program in about 11 years ago for PBS, I asked some mid-level ministers, I said, I can't ask you to, I'm just going to ask you to trust me, because if this program is 100% positive about China, nobody will believe it. They'll believe it's zero. If I tell a story that is mostly negative, say 80% negative, people will believe the 20% positive. But I said, I'm not going to be 80% negative. I don't know what we're going to be. We're going to try to tell the story of people. We're going to talk to leaders. We're going to talk to migrant workers. We're going to talk to rural women. We're going to talk to people who believe in religion. We're really going to try to understand this difference.
Dr. Quinn, in the American political vocabulary, to my knowledge, there is a phrase called panda hugger, which is not quite favorable to the Chinese image. Now, when you defend China in the U.S., are you accused of being a panda hugger?
It's a great question, and one thing that I find myself being is that when I'm in China, I defend the U.S., like on this famous program Dialogue, which I thoroughly enjoy, and when I'm in the U.S., I defend China. So I am never in the majority.
In other words, you are the public enemy of both sides.
Everybody's always arguing with me, and you know something? I love it. That's what I like, because the more we're able to express honestly, the more I can explain to you how Americans and the American media and American politicians, they really think, which is different than most Chinese think they think. And the more I can tell the American public how the Chinese think and the diversity, the better the communications are. So I think honesty and communication, and we want to be polite to each other, and I think young Ray and I are polite to each other on Dialogue, but we really, on occasion, get into some substantive issues, because it would be a mistake for me to pretend to agree and then go off and tell my friends, oh, that was terrible, I was just fooling. No, we should be very honest and very open, because that's the way to break barriers.
Dr. Quinn, perhaps you are the second Edgar Snow who wrote Red Star over China during the years of Yan'an before the new China was founded. Tell us why you were able to win the trust of those senior and high-ranking Chinese officials. What's the thing that comes from within that's so charming to the Chinese leaders who can easily trust you?
First of all, I've heard this Edgar Snow comparison. That's not something I do myself. You know, I don't write to teach or to instruct. I write for one reason. I like to learn. And the best way I can learn is to write. Because if you write it, it forces you to really understand it. You may think you understand it, but until you put it on paper, you really don't. And so writing for me has been a joy and a privilege, because I have enjoyed this process. And, you know, it's been a gradual process in terms of working with leadership. I think there are two things that have been significant in this regard. One is I did not come to China as a writer, as a reporter, as a media person. I came originally as a scientist who was an investment banker and a corporate strategy. So I knew science, I knew corporate strategy, I'd written a lot of books on investment banking. And so I came to China in a content capacity. And I grew to love China and understand China. And I became frustrated, particularly in the middle 90s when it started, when I was coming back to the U.S. and saying some interesting things about the change of China, and nobody believed me. They all thought everyone was, you know, still in exactly they were in the 1950s and early 60s, and everybody wore Mao suits, and nobody was allowed to dress differently. And so I got frustrated. So I just wanted to start telling what I saw, and that gradually began a process. So I didn't come to China to be a critic or a writer or tell a story. I came for content, and I started to tell a story because I was frustrated at the misunderstanding in the West.
Dr. Quinn, do you think we have successfully let our international friends feel comfortable with the Better City, Better Life, the Expo 2010 in Shanghai?
Well, look,
because you did some documentaries about
you know, that touches me closely, because I really enjoyed that. It's not something I expected to do. I was asked to do some documentaries, and I really got into it a great deal, and it reflected to me how the world really wants to work with China. And when you see, working with all the different pavilions and the designers and the architects and the scientists involving in the ideas for green technologies and proper urbanization, you really see great desire in all these people of wanting to work with China. In fact, many of these people who worked on the pavilions have now either set up offices in China, some have moved here, because there really is this desire to integrate China into the world. And that was that to me is the great story of Expo, is the desire of both sides to work together as never before.
So when 30 years ago, most of the foreign media said China could miraculously feed a population of, 1 billion. Today, what do you think should be the sources or evidence that could be cited to indicate the rapid growth of China and the strength of this country?
Well, look, I think there are different characteristics that one has to look to. The world looks to China's economic growth, which really is the most, I've called the most remarkable transformation in the history of the world in terms of China's development over now a little more than 30 years. But that's not the only thing. I'm often asked, what is the greatest development in China since I've been coming to China? And people expect me to say the economy. And I always say the economy, but that's the second greatest achievement that the Chinese people have done during this period. The greatest achievement is the transformation of their spirits. That if you go back 30 plus years, the kinds of things that your parents would have been afraid to say in the privacy of their bedroom, you can now text to 100 of your friends on your cell phone without any problem whatsoever. And the spirit and the possibilities that you now have is the greatest change that I think that's in China. And frankly, the world does not appreciate this, and especially the media. There are reasons for that. It's not a giant conspiracy against China. But nonetheless, it is a requirement, I believe, on China to tell its story more openly. I'm happy to play a small part. Yang Rui, my old friend, plays a wonderful part in telling the story of China to the world. And we're not happy unless we get into some debates on dialogue, which I really enjoy. But that's important. It's important to show the richness, the diversity of China in the expression of diverse ideas, diverse ways of dress, diverse ways of thinking.
We appreciate your attitude of impartiality when it comes to how to promote the mutual understanding between the two great powers, the US and China. You've visited China over 100 times, and you've been to over 20 provinces and over 40 Chinese cities here. And why did you always forget to bring your passport when you came to China?
That's a great question. I have been going to the airport on more than one occasion without my passport. And sometimes when I go to New York, where I live as well, from Los Angeles, I think I have to bring my passport. It's because I think of China as a home. Sometimes I think of New York as a foreign country.
I learned that you could also play ping pong. Without having a basic idea about the ping pong culture, you won't be called a Chinese friend, right?
Well, do
you want to show off your skills?
No, I wish there was a table here. I wish we could play. I have to tell you that this morning I played 2 hours. People ask me, I write about leaders. I wrote the biography of President Jiang Zemin. I wrote my new book about many of the leaders, President Hu Jintao's philosophies and everything. They said, do you deal with ordinary people? And I say many times a week I'm at the Dongdan Center and I'm taking 2-hour lessons from the ping pong coach, and he treats me no different than the 7-year-old girl who's better than me before and the 10-year-old boy. And if I make a mistake, if I do my loop, instead of going like that, if I go like this, he says, Chen, 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 forward, forward. So I love ping pong. And when I first came to China on my first trip, I was as a scientist and investment banker, and I was here giving advisory work to the science ministry, and they said we should take you to the Beijing Opera and the Great Wall. I said, no, I want to play ping pong. And so they arranged for me to play with I was kind of embarrassed, with one of the national players. And when he met me, this is the first time I was in China, this ping pong, so he said, do you know James Smith? And I said, no. So he's the American champion, and I beat him 21-2 last year. So it really intimidated me terribly. And so I started to play, and I hadn't played in a while, and he was very nice, and then he started to let me win. So I got 5 points, and then 7 points, and then 9 points, and I made a joke, and I said, the next game I'm going to get 11 points. And he said to me, the next game you're getting no points. And so he said, and I'll tell you what, if you get 3 points, I'm going to walk under the table and shake your hand. And there were a lot of students around watching. They're all rooting for me, of course. And I got 3 points. And he walked under the table and shook my hand. So that was my first trip to China.
In a word, Dr. Kuhn, you want to project an image of China according to what you saw and how you, or the things you learned about this country. Recently, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake took place in Japan, our neighboring country. Thousands of Chinese, ordinary Chinese, volunteered to express their sympathy, compassion for the victims of the earthquake and the tsunami, and the Chinese government also decided to send rescue teams to provide humanitarian assistance, so on and so forth. What do you think of the image of China this time around?
I think that's it's a sad, of course, events that cause people to come together, but that's the best of humanity. When there's trouble in one place, we all rally around each other. I've sometimes joked that the only way we're going to get real peace in the world and a unification among all people is if we were invaded from outer space. And then we would all get together as one to defend ourselves against an invasion. But I see what China has done for the earthquake as another sign of the emergence of China in the world in its grand transformation from a country, and now you see this emergence of China as a stable, strong country, a participant in the management of the world and reaching out. So this is another example of China coming to the fore, to its historic part of the center of the world with other nations for the greatest contribution to humanity.
When it comes to the image of China, now the word responsibility, what do you think of that for the image of a majority of the Chinese?
Well, first of all, this is essential for the world. China's participation needs to, and I'm very serious about this, take on the responsibility of a great nation, the largest nation in terms of people, and the second largest economy within, by 2025 to 2030, the best estimates, China will have the largest economy in the world, still not on a per capita basis, but on an absolute basis, and on purchasing power parity even before then. So with that comes responsibility. Many people in China are very happy and nationalistic. You should be very proud. But, you know, really there's even greater responsibility, and this is the leadership and the people. So it's a time for rejoicing, but it's also a time of recognition that with the achievement comes responsibility and burden. And China is adapting to that, but it's still not it's not as experienced because you haven't had the time. The transformation and the growth and China's emergence has been so rapid. Unparalleled in history.
And in recent months or years, Americans in particular accuse China of being arrogant and more assertive. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, first of all, those are two different concepts. To be more assertive and to be arrogant are different. You can be assertive without being arrogant. As China emerges in the world, it has every right to be assertive. But, you know, there's one Chinese minister told me that, you know, for 150 years everybody had thought China was absolutely irrelevant to the world, but he said we really weren't so weak. And now that everybody thinks we're so strong, we really aren't that strong because we have a lot of internal problems and all the things that you all know. But the perception in the West, it's very interesting. I mean, it went from one extreme to the other with no time in between. So when I did my first work on China around 2000, that was really before the world appreciated the significance. I was telling a story that, hey, China's really emerging. There's something happening here. But then, you know, maybe right before the financial crisis and then very strongly accelerated by the financial crisis, when China came through very, very well, it continued its growth, you know, with a really terrific performance. The rest of the world suffered. So suddenly the whole world saw that China had emerged. Now the feeling is that China is assertive and arrogant when you're just sort of feeling your way, I mean, in terms of this new position. But this is reality. And China has a right to be assertive. Nobody has a right to be arrogant. It's easy to be arrogant because, you know, when you've suffered humiliation for 100 years or 150 years, and you emerge. I mean, I've had some friends and people, and I've read that they feel arrogant. I mean, it's just a natural human reaction. But that's wrong, and China needs to take a deep sense of its own position and appreciate that other people will be very sensitive to China.
To enjoy more of the love from these brilliant university students in Beijing, would you go there, Dr. Kuan, and to have the Q&A answer
Absolutely.
session, please?
The harder the question, the better. You think I'm not going to like the question, then be sure to ask it.
There still exists misconception or prejudice about China, especially in some Western countries. How to make them break their old concepts or misconception and see the progress China has achieved and accept the new image of China. Thank you.
Great. Well, look, this is a great question. There is no magic solution. There's no one thing that can be done. Sometimes in the past, I've heard government leaders say we could have big programs to do this or that. Those are often good, but they never have the impact that they expect. It will only be by thousands and tens of thousands of small things that occur that will change people's image. China needs to appreciate that much of the poor image that China has is not because of a conspiracy or a Western plot to constrain China or people trying to distort China. There are some things like that, but that's really a very small minority. That most of the issues have developed because during a period of time, which was before the lives of virtually everyone in this audience, except an old man like Mr. Yang Rui and myself, that there was a time when China was not as open and not as, shall we say, conducive to world stability. And people remember that, and that's what's on their mind. It's very difficult to change. And now, because China has become so strong economically, and because there are economic problems in the U.S. and the West, unemployment, that creates a harder situation. So people naturally have a quick reaction to blame this China that is now an economic power that used to be, in their minds, that had some political problems. So it's just the way things are. And so it's, rather than feeling defensive, China should feel very understanding of people's misconception and should continue to work with people, correcting mistakes, but not thinking that there is always a conspiracy, because there isn't. People are not doing it deliberately. They're doing it for all sorts of psychological and historical reasons in general.
What do you think all the governments, Beijing, Washington, or what they can do to build up the mutual trust?
Let me start with telling you what makes it more difficult, in that in each country there are domestic political pressures. The U.S. goes through elections every 2 or 4 years. China goes through a change of leadership either every 5 or 10 years. And under those conditions, there are natural tendencies in all countries to become more nationalistic because it sort of feeds into the way popularism works. And that's just humanity. And so what we have to do is recognize in those circumstances that there are peaks and valleys, and we shouldn't take things that we hear too literally. People are doing things for their own political purposes all over. So there will be these peaks and valleys. But the solution is only, as you said, communication. Communication on every level. Whether we just talked about military communication, political communication, I believe that the media has a very strong role to play. The media, to me, in today's world, is not something that reports the news, but actually more and more makes the news. Programs like this, which will reach many countries, is very important. The more the media shows interactions, debate, discussions, honest differences of opinion that we're not embarrassed to talk about. When you have differences that you don't talk about, that's when the problem occurs. If we talk about it openly and have a difference of opinion about what's happening in one place or another, that actually makes you less suspicious of the other side. And so just the process of talking itself is an essential part of keeping relationships good and being able to solve problems. Now, the thing we have to be sensitive to in today's world with so much happening and 24-hour news and internet, that any event that occurs is multiplied and amplified substantially. So, for example, during the 2008 Olympics, you had the people attack the torch parade, and the Chinese fought back. And this became worldwide news instantly. And so we have to recognize that in today's world, there will be issues, and we have to be ready to deal with those things and recognize that problems will occur, but the way to deal with it is to deal with it directly, openly, and quickly.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Quinn, before I bring this wonderful and enlightening program to a successful conclusion, let me express our best wishes for your wife. Because your wife complained that you have done so much to China, you love China more than her. Please say hello to her on behalf of the audiences here in the studio and in front of the Chinese television. That we love her and respect her, because there is a Chinese saying, behind each successful man, there must be a lot of sacrifice of an extraordinary woman.
And in today's world, it could go the other way around, too.
Yeah. Thank you very much.